Oh, clap. Here we go. Everybody clap.
No.
Well, thank you for coming out. Thank you for members of Cafe Scientific as well as cognitive humanists who came out, and welcome to all Chris's students who are here. You probably don't need the introduction, but for the rest of you, Chris Petrakos comes from the University of Toronto Mississauga campus. He earned his PhD from Purdue University in 2011, and his dissertation was entitled Representing the Reformation, Historical Polemic and Political Behavior in the Late Stuart England. And in that he examined how the Protestant Reformation historiography influenced the development of partisan politics and the rise of the first political parties in England. If any of you were here for his last talk he gave us, which was entitled Popery versus Whiggery, he covered some of that during that talk, Cafe Scientific event. He's currently working on papers in the late 17th century. I guess this has not been updated, so he's currently...
Yeah, I've actually finished those papers, believe it or not. Yeah, those papers have been finished.
So now he's working on the Yukon.
Yeah, absolutely. So this new research, this presentation is based on some research that I'm doing on the Klondike Gold Rush and Canadian and British relations. Yeah.
So with that, please help me welcome Chris Petrakos.
Wonderful. And I just want to thank everyone for coming and listening to me when I heard Kevin talking about the importance of essentially an educated populace. That this goes back to very much a 17th and 18th century idea that through education that we are actually able to perfect society. So I think that it's in this vein that I think that what we're doing here is really important. Most of my time is spent in the classroom at the University of Toronto, and I'm grateful to be there teaching and being around young people and thinking about really big ideas. But I also think that it's important to come out into the community in which we live and present this research to people that are interested in it. So the ivory tower at the University of Toronto can be sort of lonely up there as I sort of toil away in the darkness working on my research project and don't really have anybody to talk to about it. So the last time I was here, it was 2013, and I had just finished my dissertation, and I had just taken a job at the University of Toronto, and I was working on papers pertaining to the late 17th century in England, and why 17th century English history actually matters. And I was talking about really important issues like popular sovereignty, the development of representative government, and the development of constitutional monarchy. So I mean, this research that I'm doing, I think, has implications just beyond the sort of narrowly construed academic interest. My interests in history largely center on Great Britain. So even though my earlier research, when I first got my PhD, I was sort of interested in the late 17th century, but more broadly, I'm kind of interested in Great Britain, and particularly the great liberal tradition that developed in Great Britain and spread all around the world in the modern period. So really between the late 17th century and 1900, you could say that these sort of quintessential British ideas spread all over the world, ideas of democracy, ideas of human rights. It was really between that period, so about 1700 to 1900, that the sun never set on the British Empire. So the 19th century, the period that I'm going to talk to you about today, is a period of imperialism, right? But it is also something that we might call globalization, right? So a lot of the ideas that I'm going to tell you about, mining in the Yukon, for instance, that these ideas are about the development of a globalized world. That is really what's going on here. So although the British Empire certainly did have a negative effect on the people they subjugated, they did leave a legacy of representative institutions, a belief in the rule of law, and the idea that free markets make free people. So today, for instance, India, part of the jewel of the British Empire, is the largest democracy in the world. The settler colonies, so like Canada, for instance, Australia, the United States, these were all parts of the British Empire, and today they are leaders of, for better or worse, leaders of the free world. So the period that I'm discussing today is also deeply tied to this process of globalization. So as I was sort of putting together this presentation, I'm thinking about Brexit. I'm thinking about the crisis of the European Union. And of course, I cannot speak these days without referencing, who, my friends? Donald Trump. Fantastic. I cannot speak without mentioning Donald Trump. I feel as though I know him. Because of all of these things, I'm reminded that the globalization in our modern world, is sometimes accompanied by deep backlashes and the entrenchment and re-entrenchment of national boundaries. So there's this thing going on where we're entering into this globalized world, but what we're seeing today with Brexit, the crisis of the EU, and of course Donald Trump, is the re-entrenchment of national boundaries. Whether or not this is a step forward or a step backward, I leave it up to you. So in other words, it looks as though we may well be currently seeing the end of an era, right? This may well be an end of an era. Trump talking about building the wall, for instance. This is about the re-entrenchment of national boundaries. That the era of globalization and a borderless world may well be over. So as you know, and as I just said, I can't really seem to give any presentation these days without mentioning Donald Trump. So it's in this particular context, and this is probably the only thing that you're going to remember from this presentation, because it was during the Klondike Gold Rush. So talking about Donald Trump, it was during the Klondike Gold Rush that an obscure German immigrant named Frederick Drumpf, this is Donald Trump's grandfather, left for Seattle for the gold fields and eventually made his fortune. So Donald Trump's grandfather was part of the Klondike Gold Rush, and he made his fortune as the result of it. So it was said. So the question is like, so how did this guy Frederick Drumpf? How did he make his fortune? Well, it was said that as he was crossing the White Pass. So this was an important way into the Klondike. You had one of the ways in was to go through White Pass, and as you went through White Pass, there was a ravine there. And as gold miners took their horses over the ravine, what would happen is the horses would fall, and they would fall down into the gully. So there's this is a picture here of what was called Dead Horse Gully. And so Frederick Drumpf, he's thinking like, there has to be some sort of business opportunity in all of this. So what he did is he set up a restaurant called the Arctic Restaurant and Hotel in Bennett, British Columbia, which is right near Dead Horse Gully. And he specialized in, guess what he specialized in? He specializes in, a frequent dish was fresh slaughtered, quick frozen horse. So Donald Trump's great-grandfather is making money, sort of getting his start as the result of the Klondike Gold Rush. So I just want to point out that it's ironic then that the U.S. the president who won an election on the basis of closed borders, comes from a family that made their fortune as the result of relatively open ones. Okay, so that's my Trump bit for tonight. Okay, moving on. So the story that I want to tell, the story that I'm going to tell tonight, is that as gold was discovered in the Yukon became spectacularly lucrative, right? So there's a gold rush going on, and what may well be one of the most difficult places to get to in the entire planet. So it's sort of like Mars, the moon, the Yukon, sort of almost impossible at the time. So as the Yukon became spectacularly lucrative, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain all jockeyed for power in this gold-bearing region. So as the Yukon they discovered gold there, what you see is the Yukon becoming a place of what I would call imperial contestation, right? The Great Britain wants some of it, the United States wants some of it, and all of that. So as all of these, Britain, the US, and Canada, as they jockey for power, the point is that borders are negotiated, borders are created, trade routes and tariffs were developed, and natural resources assessed. So what I'm saying is that the Klondike Gold Rush is absolutely essential to the development of Canada as a nation. So my larger project centers on Canadian and British relations just before and after the Klondike Gold Rush. So my talk for today is based, for the most part, the talk that I'm giving right now is based on an article I recently published on a guy named William Ogilvie. So William Ogilvie is one of these guys in Canadian history that had a really profound effect on Canadian history, but virtually nobody knows anything about him. So the article that I wrote on William Ogilvie is the only article that's on William Ogilvie. The point that I want to make is that he was a key player in the development of the Canadian North. So William Ogilvie's career spanned a formative period in the development of Canada. He was the Dominion Surveyor. He was the second commissioner of the Yukon territories. And so he traveled all over Canada. He traveled surveying landscapes. He recorded temperatures. He surveyed territory. He navigated rivers. So William Ogilvie, so we actually have, there is a lot of primary sources or sources that he wrote himself about his travels. So William Ogilvie most notably is the person that surveyed this line. This big, long, straight line. It's called the 141st Meridian West, and it was William Ogilvie that did that. But not only was he, he's one of these infinitely fascinating people. That not only was he a surveyor, but he was also like a sort of ethnographer of the indigenous peoples that lived in the north. He was taking notes, interviewing people. He leaves all sorts of archival material, for instance, at the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. So the interesting part of this is that at the height of the gold rush, Ogilvie was sent to Great Britain as a Canadian emissary to court British investment in the Yukon territories. So part of this story that I want to tell is essentially a story of the United States sort of being this imperialist power in the Yukon, right? And then so what happened was Ogilvie was sent to Great Britain in order to sort of drum up investment so that so Great Britain and Canada together could be a sort of counterweight for American pretensions on the frontier. I'll give you some quotes about what the first Yukon commissioner thought, and he thought that the Americans were just going to come in guns a-blazing and take over the Yukon for themselves. So Ogilvie's trip to Great Britain is really about maintaining Canadian sovereignty in the north. So Ogilvie was conscious of the fact that he was what was really on the opening of the Canadian North. And one of his great hopes for Canada, as he remarked in the last years of his life, was, and I quote, to create a peace-compelling empire. This new empire would stretch from the Arctic Ocean in the northwest to the 49th parallel and be connected to Ottawa and Toronto via railroad. So this is about creating the Canadian nation. Ogilvie worked most of his life to create this empire. He was one of the first surveyors to travel west of the Mackenzie River Basin. He plotted out all of its tributaries. He demarcated the 141st Meridian West, that big, long, straight border that separates the Yukon from Alaska. In 1889, the Canadian Department of the Interior lauded Ogilvie's courage and ability. And most significantly, it places him in the context of 19th century Canadian empire building, an empire centering on the untapped natural resources of the North, right? So this is about creating a Canadian nation that is in part based on the development of these natural resources in the North. So Ogilvie's explorations, according to the government, compared with Livingston and Stanley. And these are two really important British imperialists. So the Canadian government is comparing him to Livingston and Stanley. And the point is that they saw Ogilvie as just as much opening up the Canadian North as Livingston and Stanley did for Africa, right? Livingston and Stanley, they opened up Africa for the British Empire, for better or for worse. Mostly for the worse. His travels in the Canadian North, much like British expeditions in the wilds of Africa, entitle him to the first rank of explorers of the 19th century. One of Ogilvie's contemporaries put it rather succinctly. What they did was big, right? So this is what Ogilvie's contemporaries are saying. But Ogilvie lacks an entry in the Dictionary of Canadian National Biography. So in other words, the Canadian Dictionary of National Biography has the names of all prominent Canadian history, all prominent Canadians in in history, and Ogilvie lacks an entry in it. If Wikipedia be any standard whereby to judge someone's how well known they are, he doesn't even really have an entry. It's simply a stub, right? So historians aren't really writing about William Ogilvie, and I am trying to suggest that he was a very important player in opening up the Canadian North. So in order to understand Ogilvie, Britain, and the development of the Canadian West, we have to consider that the Klondike Gold Rush occurred along a contested border. So that's a sort of key part to this. The Klondike is on a contested border, a part of Canada that Americans had very easy access to. For the vast majority of Canadians, the Yukon was practically inaccessible. There are stories of Canadians trying to make it to Dawson, so Dawson City, where the Klondike is, trying to make it from Edmonton, which is like over 1,000 miles, and they say hell could not be worse, right? So trying to make it out there, hell could not be worse. Pierre Burton, in his magnificent book on the Klondike, talks about how people would hang themselves. Out with suicide was preferable than having to do the inland route. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the sea routes to the Yukon are virtually all American. It's very easy for the Americans to get to, right, as a result of these the inland sea traveling through the Yukon River, which I'll talk about in a second. But for Canadians, it was almost impossible to get to. So that's an important part of this. So I just want to talk about how, so this is a key part of this research project that I'm working on, and I see the Klondike as a sort of borderland. The Klondike Gold Rush happened in a place where national borders were not drawn yet, right? So it's sort of like as nation states are sort of congealing, this is the context of the gold rush, and they start to create borders, national borders, as the result. So in 1867, the United States bought Alaska from Russia, but the boundary really had yet to be determined, right? So all of this is happening in the context of like the development of the American Empire, the purchase of Alaska from the Russians, and the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1825 that stated that the boundary should be determined according to a chain of mountains that line the Alaskan coast. So in other words, they're like, yes, the Treaty of St. Petersburg assumed that there had been a chain of mountains going up the Alaskan Panhandle. Does anyone know what the problem was with this treaty? That there was no chain of mountains going up this side of the Alaskan Panhandle. So the border was very much contested. Before the Klondike Gold Rush, no one really cared. This was essentially wasteland. But once essentially, $1 billion worth of gold was there, these borders became profoundly important. So the U.S. maintained, throughout the gold rush, the U.S. maintained control of the entry ports at Dia and Skagway. And Dia and Skagway this is essentially the northern channel here. And you could this is Juneau, Alaska, and you could essentially get off here, do like a 30-mile trek, and then take the waterways pretty much to the Klondike. So not only are the borders contested on the Alaskan Panhandle, but they're also contested along the 141st Meridian West. So the 141st Meridian West was not actually surveyed with any accuracy at the time of the Klondike Gold Rush. A really great example of this is Fort Yukon. So it was in 1847 the Hudson Bay Company had set up shop here at Fort Yukon, thinking that Fort Yukon was in Canadian territory. This is how sort of undecided these borders actually are. So the Hudson Bay Company thought that Fort Yukon was in the Yukon. But it wasn't. The HBC set up a trading post, but they were expelled once it was realized that Fort Yukon was actually an American territory. So this is pretty much the state of national boundaries at the time of the Klondike Gold Rush. I mean, as gold was discovered and these countries sort of found out that there was millions of dollars to be made here, these borders became very, very important. So right now, I guess everyone always asks me, Dr. Petrakos, how did people get to the Klondike? And it was really hard. So this was the St. Michael's route, which was called the rich man's route. So if you think about it, this is essentially, think about it, this is the turn of the century, and this is over a 4,000-mile trek from Seattle, so they would leave from Seattle, San Francisco, Vancouver, and take a steamship all the way around the Aleutian Islands here, all the way up here, and go to the headwaters of the Yukon River at St. Michael. And so this is an absolutely amazing voyage that some of these people took. For most people, it began in Seattle, and the Klondike Gold Rush is as much as an American event as it is in some sense a Canadian one. Has anyone here been to Seattle and gone to the Klondike Gold Rush Museum? It's really sort of cool. I highly recommend it if you have the time. So it usually began in Seattle, which became a major imperial hub in the U.S. During the Klondike Gold Rush. So think about it. On the eve of the Klondike Gold Rush, Seattle's population was 1870. Seattle's population in 1870 was about 1,000 whites. By 1900, as the Klondike Gold Rush is sort of in full swing, think about it. 80,000 people lived there. Right, so it was like before the Klondike Gold Rush, Seattle is a one-horse town, but during the Klondike Gold Rush, it becomes a major imperial hub. It was over a 4,000-mile trip. On the eve of the gold rush, on the eve of the gold rush, it costs $100 to take this trip. So about $100. But at the height of the gold rush, it increased tenfold to $1,000, which is about $25,000 today. Yeah. So at the time of the gold rush, these sort of prices begin to skyrocket. And the sad thing, and we can talk about this later, but the sort of sad thing about this is that people went there to make their fortunes. But the real money to be had during the Klondike Gold Rush wasn't so much for people finding gold, but it was the people selling the gold miners' supplies and providing transportation, and of course ripping everybody off and that sort of thing. So that's the St. Michael's route, and William Ogilvie talks about this. So William Ogilvie wrote a sort of autobiography. It's called, of course now I can't remember, but he wrote an autobiography, The Early Days on the Yukon, and he sort of starts his autobiography by talking about what it was like to travel from St. Michael's through Alaska down to Dawson. And he said it was one of the most magical and mystical things that he's ever experienced in his entire life. It was in September, I took a boat ride up the Middle Passage from Juneau to Skagway. And it was really one of the most sort of primeval and most beautiful things that I've ever seen. Okay, so it cost a ton of money and it was a really long trip. So Dia and Skagway are these two really important little towns as people were trying to get to the Klondike through what's called the Middle Passage. So Dia and Skagway were both in disputed territory on the Alaskan coast. So in other words, if you weren't taking the rich man's route, what you were doing was taking, and it says it right here, you were taking the poor man's route. And the poor man's route involved getting off at Skagway here and then sort of doing an on-land and river trek to Dawson, which was about 500 or 600 miles north of Skagway. So what happened is Americans essentially placed exorbitant customs duties on Canadian miners from British Columbia. So from Skagway through the Chilcoot Pass to Dawson, miners would be essentially fleeced by American duties and import officers that were charging them all sorts of money and fees and all that sort of thing. So population stats in 1898, British Columbia, in the context of the Klondike Gold Rush, British Columbia had about 100,000 people, but Washington State had over 500,000. Oregon had over 400,000. San Francisco was the ninth largest city in the United States. So this is something to keep in mind, that as the Klondike Gold Rush is happening, demographics clearly favor the Americans. So this really great fear among Canadian foreign policy strategists was sort of like, oh my goodness, the United States is going to steamroller all over us, take the Klondike goldfields. And this is one of the reasons why William Ogilvie was sent to Great Britain in order to sort of shore up British power in opposition to the United States. The Chilkoot Pass, so the Chilkoot Pass, and I'll show you a slide. This is one of the famous pictures of the Klondike Gold Rush. It's all of these, it was primarily men, would get to the Klondike goldfields, they'd take the poor man's route, they'd get to Skagway, they'd travel the 30 miles. And then so once they traveled the 30 miles, you know, up the frozen tundra, or if it was summer, all of the mosquitoes, they had to go over a 3,000 foot high mountain in order to get to the Klondike goldfields. This is the Chilkoot Pass, and there's all sorts of stories. There's great pictures, and the primary sources of the people that were there explaining all of this talked nothing of the absolute misery that it was going up this thing. Yeah? Oh,
Stop the line.